just outside of Telluride, Colorado, shooting this amazing view of Wilson. And I'm excited to talk about the A7RV at this location because I have shot at a lot of the A7R cameras, not all of them. I have actually never shot the A7R, the original, but I've shot the A7R2, A7R3, A7R4, and now the A7R5 at this location. And I think it's a good place to talk about this legacy of the A7R because that is a big part of this camera, is kind of the ups and downs of the A7R series. So I had the A7R2 back in 2016. That was a breakthrough camera for me. You know, having that many megapixels, the small lightness of it, but it had some problems. It was hard to use that camera professionally. The battery life was bad. The autofocus was quirky and inconsistent. And it was just a hard to use professional camera at the time. So I went back to DSLRs for about a year after using the A7R2. The A7R3 came out in 2017, but I got it in 2018. And that camera fixed all the problems. And in a lot of ways, that's been my favorite camera overall that I've ever used. It's certainly been the camera I used the most for 2018, 2019, into 2020. And the A7R3 was one of my favorite cameras I've ever used, if not my favorite camera I've ever used. I caught some of my best shots with it, and I've shot some of my favorite places with it. And that camera fixed so many things that were kind of wrong with the A7R2. It had consistent autofocus, great battery life. The viewfinder was great. You know, the ergonomics, you know, were kind of up and down, but that's always been something with Sony, and it continues to kind of be a thing with the A7R5 a little bit. So the A7R3, but then you had the A7R4, which was kind of a, you know, 2 steps forward, 1 step back situation. It had 61 megapixels. It was great. It had a bigger, beefier body than the A7R3, which I think ultimately was a win. But the autofocus was difficult on that camera, and the autofocus accuracy was difficult on that camera. I actually have a review of that camera on our channel. I actually found it kind of difficult with a lot of lenses with that camera. I felt like, for instance, the 100 to 400, the autofocus was inconsistent, and I felt like I just wasn't getting the 61 megapixels out of that camera. So I started using Nikon. I've used Canon kind of since then, and kind of moved around all the different brands. As you know, if you've watched this channel, I use all the brands pretty consistently, and that's kind of when that era really started. And so kind of leading into the A7R5, I wasn't super ramped for this camera. This camera was, you know, it wasn't, I honestly kind of thought when it came out, I'm like, you know, I don't even know that I really want to go that direction. You know, there was, you know, on this channel, it would have made sense. You know, I do a lot of landscape photography, and this is a very, very, very good landscape photography camera. So you know, the specs were, you know, okay. It seemed like it was, you know, it wasn't anything mind-blowing, anything particularly innovative. It has the same sensor as the A7R4. But as I've used this camera, it has surprised me, and I really like this camera. Sony kind of knocked it out of the park a little bit. I can complain a little bit about the ergonomics still. In a lot of ways, what Sony did with this camera successfully is, like, you had the A7R2 that had its problems, had its quirks, and then the A7R3 kind of solved that. This definitely does that for the A7R4. It is a much more usable camera. The autofocus is on point, and I feel like I'm getting every one of those 61 megapixels. And something else that's happened in the span of time is that Sony has updated a lot of their lenses. With the A7R4, as I said in my review, the G Master Primes were where you were kind of getting that 61 megapixels, but the Sony zooms at the time were kind of lackluster. The 24 to 105 isn't particularly a fantastically sharp lens. The 70-200-2.8 and the 24-70, neither of those G Masters were particularly great. And the 100-400 is good. it's, but it's still, I feel like hopefully that lens is going to get a GM2 treatment soon. But since then, we have the 2470 G2, G Master 2, the 7200 G Master 2, the 7200 f4, which is on the camera right now, G Master 2. I have the 20 to 70 G in my bag. All of these lenses are sharp enough to utilize the 61 megapixels of the A7R5. So it's kind of a two things. Sony improved its body quite a bit and kind of fixed some of the issues, but it also, there's a boon of Sony lenses, and I feel like Sony has gotten their lens lineup to a really good place. With the camera body itself, it's kind of a if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of situation. I personally do think that Sony's ergonomics are the worst. They keep thinking that just making the grip bigger is the solution, when honestly the camera needs to be just slightly wider so you have more space to get your hand in between. And I actually have this lens collar thing, which is really cool, but it makes the problem even worse. The gloves have really come off with how customizable this camera is. This camera, is more customizable than anything that Nikon or Canon is putting out by a long way. The sheer amount of options and things that you can do and customize with this camera body is really kind of incredible. I feel like Sony has kind of reached a plane with that, where it's really kind of innovative in how customizable everything is. You have 1, 2, 3, 4 dials on it that you can customize to whatever kind of configuration you want. The exposure compensation dial is now just a customizable dial, and I use it for ISO, which is nice. I can lock off ISO if I want to. Things like that are really innovative. This back screen is kind of the best as far as design. The way that it comes off like this, but then it's also a flip screen, which has been very handy for video. There are things about the Nikon Z8s where I like it, where when it's in portrait mode, it comes out just like this. But this has the same effect, honestly, at the end of the day. And it's a very innovative back screen. And I just feel like, Sony is slowly dialing it in. Like I said, I would love to see the future generation of Sony bodies to just be a little wider, and just so you can just get a better grip on them. So as a landscape photography camera, in my opinion right now, for the money, it's hard to do much better than the A7R5. It has the most megapixels. There's things about Nikon that I like better. There's things, honestly, about Canon that I like better than what Sony does. But the extra megapixels is a big deal for landscape photography. The dynamic range, which is industry leading, honestly, is better for landscape photography. And it's still at a not outrageous price. I mean, it's more expensive than the A7R4, but it makes sense, inflation, everything else, it does. And I feel like Sony's landscape lens lineup is really tight right now. The 7200 f4, 20 to 70 f4 combo, as I've said in other videos, is a really great landscape photography combo. I think all of the camera companies are doing really great stuff with their lenses right now. And so I feel like the field has very much leveled as far as that goes. It utilizes the 61 megapixels so well. It is such a customizable body. It's still compact and light, which is great. Like I said, the ergonomics, there's things I would change, but irregardless, it still is very compact and light, which is very handy when it's in your bag. So as far as landscape photography goes, it's a fantastic camera. What I'm also happy about is that, much like the A7R3 before it, this camera is usable for a lot of other things as well. The autofocus, you could shoot weddings with this camera. You can actually change and lower the megapixels if you want. So if you don't want to deal with all 61 megapixels, you can now do that in this camera. Wedding photography, event photography, portrait photography, I feel like a lot of that stuff, much like the A7R3, is back in play, and I'm really happy to see that they did that. They refined the A7R4, they fixed its problems, and made a camera that honestly is going to have a long longevity. Much like the A7R3, I feel like this camera is going to be usable for a very long time. In a lot of ways, the A7R3 is still very relevant in today's market, maybe even more so than the A7R4. And that's very interesting to me. And I think this camera is going to have that same longevity. So investing in it is going to be a long-term, I think, good solution. There is one other little quirk, is that the battery grip does not fit on this camera very well. Sony really should have released a new version. They said it's compatible with the old one, the same one you use for the A7R4, the A1, the A9 II, the A7 IV. It all works great on those cameras, but it doesn't fit as tight or as seamless on this camera. So that's one thing that is kind of quirky. It still works, but I'd like for them to do a new battery grip at some point. I don't think they will, just for the A7R5. So that's kind of an unfortunate thing, is that if you're a big battery grip user, the experience isn't as nice as it is on like the A1, where it's on there seamlessly. It just works really well. So that's one other little disappointment. But overall, this camera has really surprised me, and I'm really glad that I have been using it for the last few months, and will continue to use it for probably a little bit here, at least to some degree. So if this review, if you enjoyed this review, you will really enjoy the A7R5 guide to landscape photography that I released about a month ago on this channel. I go over all of my settings, how I customize it, how I customize the menu. We do some live shoots in the field, and I go over and edit some photos. So it's like a whole start to finish process of landscape photography. So if you enjoy the landscape photography process, I do think you would enjoy that video, and I will link to it in the description, and then also at the end of the video. So, and we're gonna do more content like that, and like this review. Right now we're doing a lot of Sony stuff, and we'll continue for a while. We're not just a Sony channel. we shoot a lot of stuff on here. And so I'm definitely going to be doing reviews and stuff on other brands of cameras over time. So I'm not switched to Sony per se, but right now that's what we're using. And so we're going to have more content like that. And this camera is a really fun, great camera to use. So I'm happy about that. So we would appreciate it if you would like this video. It really helps us out, and subscribe. Once again, we're a growing channel, and we feel and appreciate every subscription. And with that, we'll see you on the next adventure.